We figured your back bedroom could be my mother's. She doesn't need much space. And my brother and his girlfriend can take the sunroom. That is what my son-in-law said. Not asked. Said. He was standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee I had poured for him, leaning against the counter like he'd been leaning against it for years. I set the dish towel down on the edge of the sink. Slowly, the way you set something down when you need your hands to be doing nothing for a moment. This is my home, I said. I'm not sure how that got confused. He smiled. The kind of smile that means he'd already decided the conversation was going in his direction. We just thought, with all the extra space, it made sense. You're here alone. It'd be good for everyone. My daughter was sitting at the kitchen table behind him. She was looking at her phone. She didn't look up. I had been a school nurse for 31 years. I had held the hands of children who were frightened, and the hands of parents who were more frightened still. I had learned early on that the most dangerous thing in any room was not a person who was angry. It was a person who was calm and had already made up their mind. My son-in-law was very calm. He had already made up his mind. I told him I would think about it. Not because I needed to think about it, but because I needed him out of my kitchen. He left with my daughter shortly after. They said it had been a lovely visit. I stood on the porch and watched their car back out of the gravel drive and disappear around the bend in the road. Then I went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, without turning on a light. My husband died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There is no soft way to say that. There is no version of that sentence that lands gently. It was fast and it was brutal, and I was 61 years old, and I did not fall apart. Not because I was strong, but because I did not have the luxury. My daughter was newly married. My husband's medical bills arrived before we'd finished settling the estate. I had a job to return to, a mortgage to manage, a grief that would have to wait in line behind everything else that needed doing. I worked until I was 68, not because I had to, not toward the end, because I wanted to finish what I started, because I believed in the work. Because the school where I'd spent my career had become, in some quiet way, a place that depended on me being there, and I was not the kind of person who walked away from dependence. When I retired, I gave myself 1 year. I stayed in the house my husband and I had bought together, the one where my daughter had grown up. I painted 2 of the rooms. I cleared the garage. I finally read all the books that had been sitting on the nightstand for years. And then, when the year was done, I sold it. Not out of sadness, not to run from anything, just because it was time for something that was entirely mine. I drove north on a Thursday in early April with a folder of listings on the passenger seat and no particular destination. I stopped twice for coffee and once to watch a red-tailed hawk sitting still on a fence post near the highway. I had nowhere to be by nightfall. That alone felt like a kind of miracle. I found the house on the second day. It sat back from a 2-lane road behind a row of old hemlock trees. White clapboard siding, black shutters. A covered porch that ran the full length of the front. The yard was overgrown, and the gutters needed replacing, and the kitchen was 30 years out of date. The realtor apologized for the state of it. I asked her to give me a few minutes alone. I stood in the back bedroom, the one that would later become the center of a disagreement. The window faced east, and the morning light came through it in one long, clean stripe across the hardwood floor. I counted to 10. Then I called her back in and told her I wanted to make an offer. That was 4 years ago. I replaced the gutters myself, with the help of a retired contractor down the road who did not charge me for his time, only for the materials. I planted the garden in the second year. Tomatoes, zucchini, 3 kinds of herbs, a row of sunflowers along the south fence just because they made me happy. I learned to can. I refinished the kitchen cabinets over the course of one long August weekend, every window open, the radio on. I was not in a hurry. I was not trying to prove anything. I was simply living in the way I had always wanted to live, which is to say slowly and on my own terms. My son-in-law had visited twice before the conversation in my kitchen. Both times I had cooked for him and made up the guest room and sent them home with jars of tomato sauce from my garden, I did not think of him as a difficult man. I thought of him as a man who had never been told no by anyone who meant it. His mother had been living with his brother for 3 years. His brother's girlfriend had recently said she needed more space. His parents were not elderly, not unwell, not in any kind of emergency. They were simply inconvenient, and my son-in-law had looked around at his options and seen my house with its extra bedroom and its east-facing morning light and decided that the math worked out in his favor. He did not ask me if I needed anything. He never had. The week after that kitchen conversation, my daughter called me. I could hear in her voice that she had rehearsed what she wanted to say. She told me that her in-laws were in a difficult situation. She told me that the back bedroom really wasn't being used for much. She told me it would only be temporary and that having family nearby might be good for me. Good for me, I repeated. Mom, she said, you're there alone. I reminded her that I had chosen to be there, that I had bought the house specifically because it was quiet and mine, that the back bedroom was, in fact, being used. I had set up my sewing machine there and finished 3 quilts that winter, including the one I'd sent to her for Christmas. She got quiet the way she always does when she doesn't want to argue but hasn't changed her mind. I told her I loved her. I said goodbye. I sat with the phone in my lap for a while before I set it on the table. 3 weeks passed. I did not hear from my son-in-law. I began to think, or perhaps hope, that the conversation had simply ended the way some conversations do, not with resolution, just with silence, and everyone moving on. Then I looked out my front window one Saturday morning and saw the U-Haul. It was orange, which I noticed because my hemlock trees were still winter gray and the orange was garish against them. It was not a large truck, but it was a truck. It rolled up my gravel drive without hesitation. My son-in-law's mother stepped out of the passenger side before it had fully stopped. She was a heavy-set woman I had met twice at my daughter's wedding, years ago. She shielded her eyes and looked at the house with an expression I can only describe as assessment. The way you look at a thing when you are deciding where to put it. My son-in-law got out of the driver's side. He did not look toward the house first. He went straight to the back of the truck and began undoing the latch. My daughter's car was not there. I watched from the window for what was probably 30 seconds. Then I walked to the front door and turned both locks. The deadbolt first. Then the chain, which I had installed myself the autumn before, partly for peace of mind and partly because I had never had a chain lock before and thought it was a sensible thing to have. The knock came about a minute later. Then a voice I recognized, Dorothy. He used my name the way people use a name when they are trying to demonstrate patience. Dorothy, we talked about this. We're here. I picked up my phone and dialed my daughter. It went to voicemail. I dialed again. 3rd time, she answered. She sounded like she had been awake for a while, which made me understand that she had known this was happening and had decided not to tell me. There is a U-Haul in my driveway, I said. I know, she said. I'm so sorry, Mom. He said you'd agreed. I said I would think about it. I never agreed. The knocking continued. His mother's voice now too, higher, more insistent, calling me Dorothy like we were old friends who had simply gotten our signals crossed. I told my daughter I was going to hang up and call the sheriff's department and that she might want to let her husband know. Mom, please. I hung up. I called the non-emergency line. I was put on hold for 4 minutes. I stood in the hallway and listened to the knocking, which had become less a knock and more a sustained banging. Someone tried the handle twice. The chain held without drama. When the dispatcher came on, I gave my address and explained that there were people attempting to enter my home without my permission, that they had arrived with a moving truck, and that I was inside alone. She asked if I felt in immediate danger. I said I did not feel threatened so much as invaded. She said she would send someone. While I waited, I made a cup of tea. Not because I was thirsty. I needed my hands to be busy. I measured the water and waited for the kettle, and the banging continued. And at some point, my son-in-law stopped using my name and started saying things like, "Be reasonable, and you're making this into something it doesn't need to be." The cruiser arrived in about 12 minutes. I know this because I watched the clock on the microwave. The banging stopped when the deputy's door opened. I could hear voices outside, official and flat. My son-in-law's voice rising, and then a pause, and then quieter. His mother crying, not from distress, I thought, but from strategy. The truck idled for another few minutes. Then the engine cut. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch. The deputy was a young man, younger than my daughter. He looked at me with an expression that was professional and also slightly apologetic, the way people look when they have arrived at a scene that was never supposed to get this far. "Ma'am, are you all right?" I told him I was fine. I thanked him for coming. My son-in-law was standing near the truck, arms folded, jaw set. His mother had gotten back into the passenger seat. He looked at me the way people look when they believe they are the wronged party and are waiting for the world to agree. The deputy explained, briefly and without unkindness, that entering a residence without the owner's explicit permission constituted trespassing, regardless of the nature of the relationship. My son-in-law said that this was a family matter. The deputy said that the homeowner had not consented to entry and that the homeowner had asked them to leave. They left. The truck backed out slow, and the gravel settling after it went quiet felt like a sound of its own. I went inside and locked the door again and sat down in the armchair by the front window. The cup of tea had gone cold. I drank it anyway. My daughter called that night. She was crying. She said she didn't know he was going to do that. She said she should have called me. She said that things at home were very tense and she didn't know what to do. I listened. I let her talk until she ran out of things to say. Then I told her I loved her and that none of what happened was her fault, and also that I would not be revisiting the question of who lived in my house. She said she knew that. She said she was sorry. I believed her about the sorry. I wasn't sure yet what she knew. 2 days later, the post appeared. My daughter told me about it before I found it myself, which I appreciated, though the warning did not do much to soften it. My son-in-law had written it. He had posted it in a neighborhood community group that was loosely affiliated with the town, though I was not a member. A friend of mine from church forwarded it with a note that said she thought I should see it. He had written that his mother-in-law had locked her own family out of her home and called the police on them. He wrote that she was a bitter, isolated woman who had chosen her property over her grandchildren. I have no grandchildren, which he would know if he had been paying attention, and that she had embarrassed them in front of the whole neighborhood. He had included a photograph taken from the road, just the front of my house, the U-Haul, visible in the frame, and a caption that called it a sad day for families. I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop and went out to the garden. It was too cold to do much, but I raked the beds and pulled a few dead stalks and just moved around in the air until the feeling in my chest had room to breathe. That evening, a woman from my church called to check on me. She had been following the thread. She told me that several people had responded in my defense. One in particular, a retired librarian from the north end of town who I barely knew, who had written simply, "I was driving past that property the morning in question. There was no family gathering there. There was a moving truck and a man who was very loud about not getting what he wanted." That's all I saw. I did not respond to the post. I did not ask anyone to defend me. I did not call my son-in-law. I sat with the library woman's words for a long time, and then I went to bed and slept better than I had expected. What surprised me in the weeks that followed was not the anger. I had expected that. It was the quiet that came after. A kind of reorganization. The way a room looks different after you've moved one piece of furniture. Something about the whole incident had shifted the way I saw my own house, not as a place I was protecting from intrusion, but as a place I was choosing, actively, every single day. I had a back bedroom with morning light and a sewing machine, and 3 finished quilts hanging on the wall. I had a garden that would come back in April. I had a porch that caught the last of the afternoon sun in a way I had not fully appreciated until I started making a point to sit in it. I called a locksmith and had a new deadbolt installed on the back door as well. Not because I was afraid, just because it was overdue. My daughter called twice a week, regular as weather. We did not talk about her husband. We talked about the garden and about the book she was reading and about whether I needed anything from the city before she visited in the spring. The subject of his parents had apparently been resolved in some other way, or deferred, or simply never spoken of again. I did not ask. She did not offer. In February, I had a leaking pipe under the kitchen sink. The contractor who had helped me with the gutters was visiting his daughter in Florida. I watched a video online, bought the parts, and fixed it myself. It took most of a Saturday afternoon, and at one point, I was lying on my back on the kitchen floor, with water still dripping on my sleeve, and I laughed, not bitterly, just at the absurdity of being 68 years old and on the floor under a sink and perfectly content. I told my daughter about it on the phone that Sunday. She said I should have called someone. I said I was someone. I think she understood what I meant, though she didn't say so. The first time I saw my son-in-law again was at my daughter's birthday dinner in March. She had planned it carefully, neutral restaurant. Several other people present. A kind of diplomatic cushioning. I dressed well, which I believe in as a form of preparation. I arrived first. He came in behind my daughter with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw doing the thing it does when he is trying to look unbothered. He shook my hand. I shook his. We said the appropriate things to each other. He told me the drive up had been easy. I said I was glad. We sat at opposite ends of the table with several people and several plates of food between us, and the evening passed without incident. But at one point, near the end of dinner, when most of the table was engaged in another conversation, he leaned forward slightly and said, low and without looking at me directly, "I think you overreacted." I set my fork down the same way I had set the dish towel down in my kitchen the first time we had this conversation. Slowly, deliberately. I waited until he met my eyes. "I asked you not to do something," I said. "You did it anyway. I protected my home. I don't think that's overreacting. I think that's the only appropriate thing I could have done." He looked back at his plate. He didn't answer. I picked my fork back up. My daughter watched this exchange from across the table. I could see in her face that she had heard it, that she knew what it was. She looked at her husband and then at me, and she didn't say anything at all. But later, in the parking lot, she hugged me longer than she usually does. She pressed her cheek against mine for just a moment longer than a regular goodbye. I don't know entirely what that meant, but I thought it meant something. Spring came the way it always does up here, slow, and then all at once. The hemlocks came back first, a pale new green against the old branches, then the forsythia along the side yard, then the first hard push of green through the garden beds. I planted later than I'd meant to, the knee giving me trouble for a stretch in April. But by May, the tomatoes were in, and the sunflowers were started in trays on the back porch. A neighbor I'd gotten to know over the winter, a retired nurse herself, widowed like me, who lived about a mile up the road, stopped by one afternoon with a cutting from her hydrangea. We drank coffee on the porch and talked about the town board and about her granddaughter's college plans and about what it felt like to wake up in the morning with no particular obligation. "It feels like something I didn't know I was allowed to have," I said. She smiled and said she'd felt the same way the first year. And the second. And honestly, still. She left around 4 and I sat on the porch until the light went, and then a little while after that. I thought about my husband, not with the particular ache of missing him, just with something quieter, an awareness of him. He had always said that I was the most capable person he knew and that I should try to believe it. I had always said that was very sweet and had mostly not believed it. But sitting on that porch in the May evening, in the house I had found and fixed and kept, I thought about it again. My son-in-law's parents moved into a rental about 20 minutes from my daughter's house. I heard this from my daughter, stated as simple information with no particular emotion attached to it. She said it was actually working out fine. I said I was glad to hear it. Neither of us said anything else about it, which felt right. In June, I finished the 4th quilt. It was the most ambitious one I'd tried, double wedding ring pattern, which is painstaking in the way that the work I like best tends to be. I spread it out on the guest bed to look at it properly, and stood there in the morning light with my hands on my hips and thought, with some satisfaction, that I had made something that would outlast me. My daughter visited in July. She came alone. We worked in the garden in the morning and drove into town for lunch and came back and sat on the porch in the afternoon with iced tea and a silence between us that was comfortable rather than careful. At some point she said, "I know it was wrong. What he did." I looked out at the yard. I didn't say anything right away. I know you do, I said finally. She was quiet for a moment. I just didn't know how to. You could have called me, I said. Not to fix anything, just to tell me it was coming. That would have mattered. She nodded. I know. I'm sorry. We sat with that for a while. The evening was coming in soft and slow the way it does in July, up here. A hummingbird came to the feeder I'd hung off the porch rail and hovered for a few seconds and then was gone. I don't need you to manage him, I said, but I need to know you see what I see. She said, I see it. I believed her. Not completely, not without reservation, but enough. Enough to reach over and put my hand on hers for a moment. Enough to mean it. She left the next morning. I waved from the porch until her car had gone around the bend in the road and the sound of it had faded. Then I went inside and washed the breakfast dishes and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden. The sunflowers had come in tall that year, better than the year before, which had been better than the year before that. There is something I have learned about this kind of garden work. About all of it, really. The replacing of locks, and the fixing of pipes, and the planting of things that take 3 seasons to find their full height. It does not happen fast. It does not announce itself. It simply keeps going. And one morning you look up from what you are doing and something has grown that was not there before, or not tall enough to see, or not yet ready to hold its own weight in the wind. The back bedroom still has my sewing machine in it. The morning light still comes in that east window in one long, clean stripe across the floor. I have no plans to change either of those things. Last week, I drove into town for groceries and stopped at the post office on the way home. The woman behind the counter, who has been there as long as I have lived in this town, handed me a small stack of envelopes and said, "Lovely morning, isn't it?" I told her it was. I drove home with the windows down. The hemlocks were something in that light, dark green and standing very still. I turned up my gravel drive and parked and sat for a moment before going in. This house is mine. Not in the way of a thing that can be taken or contested or divided up on a clipboard. Mine in the way that peace is yours when you have stopped pretending it isn't what you wanted all along. I went inside. I put the kettle on. I went to the back bedroom and sat at the sewing machine and picked up where I had left off, which is exactly where I had left it, exactly where I expected it to be. No one was coming. No one was expected. The windows were clean and the locks were solid and the garden was growing the way it grows, which is to say without asking anyone's permission and without explaining itself to a single soul. That is all I ever wanted, to live like that, to finally earn the right to say, this is mine, and I am staying, and there is nothing more to discuss.